Hey, welcome to Ancient Philosophy Lecture 17. Today we're going to be talking about Aristotle on the nature of mind, on how the mind grasps forms, on the relationship between the mind and the forms, and also we'll talk about Aristotle's conception of deliberation and free will. Aristotle's conception about the mind occurs in his broader discussion about the powers of the soul. So he thinks, as we saw in the last lecture, that all living things have soul. Remember, the soul is the explanatory principle that organizes matter into the force that makes it alive. He thinks that plants have powers of nutrition and reproduction, animals have powers of movement and perception, in addition to nutrition and reproduction, and then humans are unique in that we have the power to reason, to use the mind in a special way for theoretical and practical reasoning. Now, for Aristotle, he thinks that the world is intelligible in virtue of the fact that matter is combined with form, and form is intelligible. So for understanding, this occurs when the understanding takes on the forms and the forms enter the soul. So this is a really interesting idea that features in the world that explain the growth, reproduction, movement, perception, and so on can enter into the soul of an individual with understanding, and in a way the soul takes on those very forms. The analogy that Aristotle has is, as we've talked about with sensory faculties. Sensory faculties take on sensory forms, and we saw in that discussion that sensory forms are distinct from the forms in objects, the forms that explain the growth and development of that object. But the sensible form is another kind of form that is in the sensible object. With a tree, for example, it has the form which explains its nutrition and growth. It also has the sensible form, which is its appearance. So what we want to do here is we want to explain what's going on here in the mind when it takes on intelligible forms. The intelligible forms are the essence, the logos of things. So there's, in a way, a tighter relationship between the intelligible form of a thing and its form that explains the nutrition and growth and so on. There's a difference here in how the mind takes on intelligible form, because intelligible forms are the logos of things. So there's a tighter relationship here than between the senses taking on an appearance of things. So Aristotle thinks that the mind, what he calls nous, is the special faculty that grasps essences. Now for Aristotle, essences, remember, are embodied in material things, and they make the material things the things that they are. So it's interesting that Aristotle thinks that the mind, nous, is not material. He reasons that the mind's capable of thinking about all things, and the more intelligible a thing is, the more capable it is of being thought. But Aristotle reasons that this isn't the case with the senses. For if you look at a very bright light, for example the sun, it can ruin the sense of sight. And so the brightest objects themselves destroy the senses. Now, his view that the mind here is not material plays an important role in his overall philosophy. And so we'll talk about that a little bit as we proceed. So there is a question here that I alluded to earlier, is how does the form in animals, their essences, stand to the form in the mind? This is a matter of interpretation and debate, and in my view, it's best to think of it as a strong similarity. There is a simple way of thinking about Aristotle's view that doesn't seem adequate. So remember when we talked about the sensory faculties and how they take on sensible forms. If you look at a simple case where the eye perceives red, the eye doesn't really turn red, or doesn't need to turn red in order for this perception to occur. In fact, as we saw, painting the eye red doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to perceive red. Similarly, when the mind can grasp the intelligible forms of things, so you grasp the essence of a horse, the mind doesn't literally become a horse. It's not as if your nature changes so that you no longer would become a person, that you would then begin to grow and develop into a horse. That would be very, very odd. But what Aristotle does make clear is that in some sense or another, when you grasp the essence of things, your mind takes on that very form. How this works out is a matter of debate. If we had more time, we could talk about that. Another question that I wanted to raise here is how the mind can think about itself. So the senses don't sense themselves. Vision doesn't sense vision. Hearing doesn't sense hearing, and so on. But the mind has the ability to turn inward, to think about its own thoughts, to think about its nature. So here's what Aristotle says about this, and we can draw some lessons from this. So he says, mind itself is thinkable in exactly the same way as its objects are. For in the case of objects which involve no matter, what thinks and what is thought are identical. In the case of those which contain matter, each of the objects of thought is only potentially present. It follows that while they will not have mind in them, for mind is a potentiality of them only insofar as they are capable of being disengaged from that matter, mind may yet be thinkable. So this is an interesting remark that he makes. He thinks that his account that the mind is not material enables him to explain how the mind can turn on itself and think its own thoughts. So contemporary philosophers think of the mind as something that has within it beliefs and desires and so on, and that we can form judgments about those, and those judgments are distinct from the beliefs and desires. So we can have beliefs about beliefs, so we can have desires about our desires, or beliefs about our desires, or so on. In the case of Aristotle, he thinks that the mind is immaterial, that it has the potentiality for taking on intelligible objects, and so when it turns to itself and think, that activity of self-reflection is itself the same thing as being a thinking mind. So again, I just want to highlight here what I think is an interesting consequence of Aristotle's view that the mind is immaterial. Okay, so let's turn to the mind in action. So humans have a distinct ability to act for reasons such that they are a principle of a source of action. Now, human action is a species of animal action, and for animals, Aristotle thinks that he can explain movement in terms of perception and desire. That animals see, right, an object, and they desire that object, and so that explains their movement. This falls more generally into a belief and desire model of action. If you fix a person or an animal's beliefs and their desires, then that will yield action. Now, there is a puzzle here about human action. So one philosophical question is whether belief and desire are enough to explain how an action can be free. So suppose, for example, that you give me a piece of dark chocolate. I have a standing desire to eat dark chocolate, and so I will be compelled to eat dark chocolate. Now, I believe that there's dark chocolate in front of me. I desire dark chocolate, and so I'm motivated to eat the dark chocolate. And so the question is my action there a free action? So Aristotle has a theory of deliberative activity that is intended to explain voluntary action and fits in his overall ethical system. So this is the reading that we're doing for this section in the Nicomachean Ethics. So one of the questions is how to understand this unique deliberative faculty that individuals can act for reasons in a way that we don't see in the animal kingdom. Another related question is how reason falls in this belief and desire scheme of action. So if you judge that an action is good, does that judgment itself give you a reason? Does that judgment itself motivate you to perform that action? So philosophers are split on this, and so what we want to do is just fill out Aristotle's theory of deliberation. Okay, so let's talk about Aristotle's theory of deliberation. In Greek, the word there is boulissis, which is derived from the Greek word for willing. So Aristotle's view is that desire gives us an end, and deliberation transfers the desire for that end to the means of that end. So his picture is that we desire various ends. So we desire, for example, good health. And then we reason about the best way to achieve this good health. And then when we determine what the best means are for reasoning about that end, then the motivation we have for good health transfers to the motivation we have for, say, eating right and jogging and so on. So here's what Aristotle says in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3, Chapter 3. He says, the same thing is deliberated upon and chosen, except that the object of deliberated choice is already determinate. Since it is that which has been decided upon as a result of deliberation, that is the object of deliberated choice. For everyone ceases to inquire how he is to act when he has brought the moving principle back to himself and to the ruling part of himself, for that is what he chooses. So he's offering this account of deliberation that, as we've said, the deliberative process results in a transfer of desire from the conclusion to the means. Now, an interesting feature of Aristotle's view here is that he thinks that we don't deliberate about ends. Now, this is in part because of the special way he's thinking about deliberation. He says in Book 3, Chapter 3, he says we deliberate not about ends, but about what contributes to ends. For a doctor does not deliberate about whether he shall heal. So this can seem kind of curious to us, because certainly there's a sense in which you can deliberate about whether you're going to be a doctor or whether you're going to be an artist. And you can have various reasons for choosing those. So Aristotle thinks here that it would be wrong to conceive of yourself as having a desire to live the good life. And you see the choice between being a doctor and the choice between being an artist as a means to achieving the good life. He thinks that in contrast, that this case is more like a case of falling in love. That you already have a deep desire to be a doctor and you already have a deep desire to be an artist. And so the reasoning that you're engaged in isn't one of transmitting desire from the desire to live the good life to the desire to be a doctor. This is important to realize that Aristotle is going to allow for practical reasonings in these kinds of cases, but the reasoning isn't going to be one of deliberation because there's not a transfer of desire. I want to end my remarks here with some general remarks about human freedom and how that fits in with Aristotle's view of deliberation, and then also to set us up for the discussion of Aristotle's view of ethics, which is coming next week. So there is a tradition within Western philosophy that thinks about human freedom as detachment from one's desires. So you can see this in Kant and Spinoza and others. So Kant has the view that a free agent must reflect on his desires from a standpoint outside of desire. And then if the agent decides by an act of reason to perform that action, then that action is free. One of Kant's cases is that of a shopkeeper who's selling various goods to the public. And he is motivated by profit to sell these goods, but he is also motivated by profit to realize that he wants to sell them at fair prices, because in the long haul he'll make more profit by selling these at fair prices. And Kant thinks that to the extent that the person is motivated by the desire to make profit, the choice to sell at fair prices isn't morally praiseworthy, that it's not a free choice. So Kant's view fits in with a broader libertarian view, where a free agent to choose freely needs to choose in accord with a will, where this is a standpoint that is distinct from desire. A compatibilist pitcher, by contrast, thinks that in general a free agent can choose in accord with their beliefs and desires. Now, compatibilists say you have to have the right kinds of beliefs and desire. Not any kind of belief and desire counts. So Aristotle falls in this picture of more compatibilist conception of human freedom. He thinks that desires set ends, that deliberation is a rational process that thinks about means to achieve those ends, and that the will acts freely when motivated by a desire to achieve the best end. For your goal, you choose to perform that action. So Aristotle's ethical outlook is that the good life aims for happiness. It aims for, in the Greek, eudaimonia. And what we'll see next week is that this word is not entirely correctly translated as happiness. It really refers to flourishing, to doing well. And this requires an organization of desire under a rational organization. So we see here something similar to what we saw in Plato's Republic, that to live the just life, it requires an organization of desire. And for Aristotle, he too thinks that the good life requires a proper organization of desire. Okay, so we will pick up next week when we start talking about Aristotle's conception of the good life. You should be thinking about your papers, so email me if you have topics. So we will have no final exam, we'll just have papers. And I look forward to reading your thoughts, and hope you guys have a good weekend.